Good morning. Welcome back. I think it was demonstrably clear from last week's discussion that Judaism comes down as completely supportive of the idea of action. Faith has a very important role. It's the foundation. Emotions and feelings have an extremely important role. They are the soul of our Judaism. But when it comes to what is the absolutely most important part of being Jewish, it all comes back to action, practice. And in Hebrew, we have one word for it, and that is the word mitzvah. And the word mitzvah has many connotations. And the most commonly held translation of the word mitzvah that you learn in Hebrew school 101, Hebrew school 201, Hebrew school 301, and for the rest of your life you hear it from everyone that a mitzvah is a good deed. And I can't argue with that because a mitzvah is indeed a good deed. But that's not the translation of the word mitzvah. So what's the big deal? So what if it's not the right translation? What is missing if we focus on that translation? Because we all agree that it's good to do a good deed. I don't know anyone who's going to argue that, no, good deeds are out, now we're into bad deeds. No one's going to say that. So we all agree that a good deed is indeed a good deed. So what's wrong with the translation of a mitzvah as a good deed? Nothing is really wrong. It's just that it's limited. It's very limited. Besides not being the precise translation, it's limited. And there's a cute story, and it illustrates my point, of this very wealthy individual who held this banquet and served gourmet food. And when the banquet was over and the guests had left, there were a lot of leftovers. So he tells his wife, there's a poor man who lives down the street. Please take the leftovers so he can feed his family. And the wife said, but the food has been left out several days. There was no refrigeration then. The food is beginning to smell. It's putrid. It's not good. And the husband says, you're going to deny me the mitzvah of feeding a poor person? And besides that, it's a sin to waste. And I'm into mitzvahs. So do as I say and bring the food to that poor man so his family should have what to eat. Well, obediently, she follows her husband, his orders, and she feeds the poor man. 2 days later, she comes to her husband. He said, do you hear the news? What news? The poor man that we fed? Yes, he's very ill. He's in the hospital. Food poisoning. And he says, wow, that's an opportunity to do a mitzvah. And he runs to the hospital to visit the sick and to try to comfort him, make him feel good, and do whatever he can. He spoke to the doctors that they should take good care of him and so on and so forth. And he felt very good about it. He goes home. A day later, his wife comes to him. Did you hear the bad news? The poor man that we fed that was in the hospital, he passed away. Oy vey. And he doesn't have the means to be buried in a dignified burial. He goes to the undertaker and he says, I'm going to pay for all the funeral expenses. Nothing should be withheld from him because of finances. I'll take care of everything. So of course not only does he have a real dignified funeral, the rich man puts an ad in the newspaper and makes phone call, gets his secretary to make phone calls, and there's hundreds of people at the funeral. Even the rabbi of the town wouldn't get such a nice funeral. And after the funeral is over, he makes sure to provide food for the widow and the orphans. He comes to the Shiva house. He pays them a Shiva call. He really does everything to comfort the mourners, and he gives them a hefty sum to be able to stand on their 2 feet, and takes real good care of the widow and the orphans. They shouldn't have to worry about the future. And after all that is over, he goes to his wife. He says, my dear wife, look at all these mitzvahs you could have denied me if you wouldn't have fed the rotten food to this poor man. We would have wasted the food. We would not have given tzedakah. I could not have visited the sick. I could not have buried the dead. I couldn't have comforted the mourners. I couldn't have supported a widow and orphans. And look how many mitzvahs I now have. Good deeds. The problem with good deeds very often is that we do the good deeds for ourselves, so we should feel good about it. And that's still better, as long as you don't feed them spoiled food. It's still better than not doing the good deed. But the problem with defining a mitzvah simply as a good deed leads to very subjective understandings of what a good deed is that involves too much of our own egos, too much of our own pleasure that we get out of doing a good deed. What is the translation of the word mitzvah? The word mitzvah literally, and the most basic translation, is commandment. The 10 commandments are actually not 10 commandments, they're 10 statements. But if we had to translate the word 10 commandments, it would be Aseret HaMitzvot, the 10 commandments. That's a simple translation. We're going to go through today and next week, God willing, 20 different levels of a mitzvah. 20 different, not translations of the word. There are only 2 possible translations, maybe a third one. But we're going to go into 20 different dimensions of a mitzvah. Today we'll try to cover the first 10. Next week the other 10. Hopefully we'll have enough time. Each one of these 10 deserves a lecture unto itself. So we're going to go through them quickly. And maybe in another future occasion we'll do a whole course just on, or a whole year of courses just on these 20 different functions of a mitzvah. But the very first function of a mitzvah is contained in the simplest, most basic translation of the word as commandment. Why do we do a mitzvah? If you ask someone, why do you do the mitzvah? The most fundamental reason and the simplest and the most honest answer is that because God said so. He commanded me. Well, why did he command you? You missed the whole point. I'm giving you something that has infinite value. I'm telling you that you're doing something that is God's will. How could there be anything that surpasses that? There's no need for any reason. When a person understands and grasps the idea that God commands us and that we do God's will, there is nothing beyond that. You don't need a reason. Just like God doesn't exist because. We exist because. The first letter in the Torah, beginning of Genesis, is a letter, the Beis, or Bet. One of the translations of that prefix is because. God created the world because. In other words, creation has to have a reason, a cause. But God doesn't need a cause, because if God needed a cause, he wouldn't be God. That's the very definition of God, that he is beyond having a cause or having a source, an origin. So if God doesn't have a reason to exist, he just exists. His will is likewise beyond needing a reason. The fact that there are reasons for mitzvahs, and we'll go through many different dimensions of the mitzvah that do give you some flavor to the mitzvah, that's above and beyond the basic idea of a mitzvah, that it is God's commandment. There was a very devout, very special Jew who passed away a few years ago, and he was a remarkable person, and he once came to the Rabbi, and the Rabbi asked him to do something, and the Rabbi proceeded to give him explanations why he's asking him to do this. And he broke down crying. He says, Rebbe, don't tell me why. I want to do it because you're telling me to do it. I don't need the reason. The reason sometimes is very important, and we'll get into that, why we need reasons. But there's always a more fundamental aspect. It's God's will. That's it. There's no other need for a reason from that perspective. Because God is the end, not just a means to an end. Likewise, his commandments are not a means to an end. Because it's hard for us to think those terms, because everything in life even the things that we think of as an end is always a means to another end. Why do you work? Because you want to earn a living. So the end is the living and the work is the means. Well, why do you want to earn a living? Why? Because I want to support my family. That's the end. Well, why do you want to support your family? Well, we can keep on going ad infinitum. There's no limit how far you can go, because every end is a means to another end. God is the one thing that doesn't have, and it's not a means to an end. He is the end, the beginning and the end. And the commandment is our way of expressing that aspect of God, that He is the ultimate beginning and end, and you don't need a reason. You transcend the need for reasons. And this doesn't mean that Judaism is anti-rational. Judaism has all the layers that you want to have in a perfect relationship. If you think of a relationship such as a marriage, which is supposed to be the ideal relationship between people, doesn't always work out that way, unfortunately. But if we have an ideal marriage, your relationship is not based simply on the reason, I love my spouse because she's a good cook. Oh, that's it? That's the extent of your relationship. Then you should hire a good chef if you have the means to do that. Why do you need a wife? Well, she's also this and she also provides that. If that's all the marriage is, it could be reduced to what means your spouse serves, then it's a very deficient marriage. Our relationship with God transcends the need for a reason. But on top of that, it doesn't hurt if your wife is a good cook or some other reasons why your marriage provides you with whatever benefits. There's nothing wrong with having additional aspects of a marriage. So that's the first focus of a mitzvah, that it's a commandment. It doesn't need a reason. Then we go to a second level. It's called in Latin, imitatio Dei, which means simply emulating God. We are creatures of art. We love art. We love to draw pictures of other things. That's what art is. You're creating an image of something else. You're replicating something else on a canvas or in any other art form. Judaism, through its mitzvahs, are the ultimate art form, because you are imitating, by your observances of the mitzvahs, by your performance of the mitzvahs, you're imitating God. You're emulating God to the extent that we could emulate God. Of course, we can never emulate God, who is unfathomable and beyond our ability to comprehend, but there are things that God does and is associated with, such as feeding the world, such as visiting the sick. We read the story in the Torah, how God visits Abraham when he was recovering from circumcision. God buries Moses, he buries the dead. He does all the nice things that we want people to do for others, among various spiritual actions as well, that we have to emulate. By emulating that, we are achieving the ultimate artistic expression that we are emulating, but it's more than just art. Because what art does, let's say you have a picture of a beautiful mountain range, a beautiful sunset. The sunset and the mountain range themselves are emulations of something else. Everything in nature is a manifestation of a godly force, of a godly power. So nature is an art form. When you draw a picture of nature, you're drawing a picture of a picture. When you do a mitzvah, that is a picture of God. You just created on the canvas of your soul and body a picture of God by your kindness, by your compassion, by your doing whatever mitzvah it may be. So the mitzvah is the ultimate art form that is not just something that replicates something else, it replicates truth. Because everything in this world is a deception. Nature, by its definition, is a deception. when you look at nature and all you see is the outer garb of nature, you don't see the eternal divine energy within nature, so you're being deceived. It's like the child who sees a glove going through the window and dropping off a toy. So the child thinks that a glove produces toys. Well, that's true. The glove did drop the toy down through the window. The child doesn't realize that behind the glove is a hand, behind the hand is an arm, behind the arm is a body, and behind the body is a nice friend of the family who wants to give the kid a candy or a toy. So the child sees reality, the glove is real, but it's a deception because he doesn't see what's behind it. When you look at nature, when we all look at nature, we don't see the reality of nature. So what nature itself is not real, is artificial. That's probably where the word art came from, artificial. And you're drawing something that is an artificial representation of something that is artificial. So the real ultimate art form is a mitzvah, because that is a replication of something that is real, of a divine truth, a divine reality of God's kindness, of God's compassion, or whatever the divine trait that we're emulating may happen to be. If you look at the text 1a, 1b, these are the commandments of the Torah. You should observe the commandments and walk in his ways. That's the basis for the commandment, to emulate God. What do you mean, his ways? What are God's ways? Well, we don't know except by reading the Torah, and we see what God does in the Torah. We assume, and correctly so, that those are God's ways, and we emulate those ways of God. Text number 2, you have an interesting midrash. God's way is not like the way of flesh and blood. The way of flesh and blood is, meaning humans, is that he instructs others to do, but does not do so himself. Do as I say, not do as I do, is a famous saying that we often hear people say about other people. God, however, what he himself does, that is what he tells Israel to do, and observe. As it is stated, he tells his words to Jacob, his statutes, his judgments to Israel. In other words, God does certain things, and he says, I want you to copy me. I want you to emulate me. So when you do a mitzvah, you should feel the way an artist feels when he completes a beautiful piece of art, a beautiful sculpture, a beautiful composition, a beautiful symphony, because that's what every mitzvah is. If we would think a little bit about what we accomplish when we do a mitzvah, we would feel this joy, this exhilaration, the way the creator of beautiful art and music feels when they finish their creation. Only ours is much more real. A third level of the mitzvah, reciprocation. God does mitzvahs, tells us to replicate him. And when we do it, God says, okay, I'm going to repeat what you just did. In other words, the good that we do in this world generates God's reciprocal action of that same type of good. So if we are kind, God reciprocates by more kindness. So in addition to the initial kindness that we emulate, God emulates us. And that's a very powerful thought. The Baal Shem Tov and his successor always emphasized this point. They quoted Ethics of the Fathers. There's a saying, know what is above you. And in Hebrew, it's very easy the syntax could read and render two different translations. Know what is above you. The simple meaning is that a person should realize that there is an eye that sees, an ear that hears, that he should realize that God is aware of what we do. But the Hasidic interpretation of that is, know that what happens above comes from you. That God reacts to us. God gives us so much power that what we do determines God's course of action. Yes.
So you're saying that as more mitzvahs are being performed, then the kindness of God should reciprocate in kind.
Yes.
Why is the world getting worse and worse as time goes on? You say that there are more mitzvahs being created as time goes on.
You say the world is getting worse? Depends where you look and what you're looking at and how you're looking at things. I think the world has become incredibly better, although there's still a tremendous amount of evil in the world. If I could give you a few, no, much. You're talking about, there's a cycle over here. Things get a little better, things get worse economically. There's not one person in America that is starving because there's a lack of food available to that person. They might be starving for other reasons, mental conditions that they don't know how to. Again, the same thing. There's not one person in the world that is starving because there's a lack of God's beneficence to this world. There's enough food to feed 70 billion people in this world, not 7 billion. The reason why people starve is because of corruption. That's why. It's not because of God's kindness. In fact, God has given us the resources now more than ever before. When the famous predictions of, what was his name? Malthusian predictions that we would all die of starvation if we had, I think, 1 billion people. And now we have 7 billion, and we have tons more food than we ever could have imagined. Yeah, there are crop failures. You know what? If the world would be the perfect world, we wouldn't be sitting here in Buffalo. We would be in Yerushalayim with the Beis HaMikdash with Mashiach. So right now, we're still in an imperfect world, and there's still a long way to go in terms of making the world perfect. It can happen overnight, but it's still, our work is cut out for us. But in terms of how the world is better off in terms of God's kindness to us, we have the means to treat illnesses that kill people in their 20s and their 30s and their teens and their childhood. And today it's just a shot of penicillin. There are the lifespan, the life expectancy today is 70s, 80s. People in the 90s are not worse. 100 people living over 100 and living normal lives is increasing by the thousands. Life is changing for the good, in a general way, while there are certainly many individuals and groups that are still suffering because they haven't yet received that kindness, that beneficence. I mean, this is a subject we can talk about for a long time. I just want to add one more point. When God gives a certain amount of kindness, there's no guarantee that we will be beneficiaries of it, because there could be all sorts of people causing blockages. So when you look at what the world has, the opportunities the world has, with all of our technology, medical technology in particular, we have the means to live perfect lives, relatively speaking, compared to any other period in history. And the reason why we're still not at that point is because we have blockages caused by certain elements in society that are evil, that are selfish, that are greedy, and so on and so forth. And that will change in kind as well. Just one example of how the world changed for the good in very general ways. I don't know, as recent probably as 100 years ago, we had empires. And each empire was trying to conquer the other empires. And it had no regard for human life. It had no regard for anything on either side. We no longer have those empires. And maybe there's one that is still trying to get world domination. The Islamic fanatics are trying to do that. But besides that, there's no Soviet Union looking for world domination. There's no one is really looking for world domination, ready to slaughter everyone in its path just to take over. Right now, our problems are within our countries, internecine quarrels, and things have gotten significantly better. Now, of course, we shouldn't be blind to the negatives, but we shouldn't be just focusing on the negatives. It always seems that things are much worse now. I mean, I can't imagine how things could be worse now than they were during the 20th century, with communism and Nazism being the two dominant forces. But we can leave that discussion for another time to go into more detail. The fourth reason, or the fourth dimension of a mitzvah, and this is related to a translation of the word mitzvah. As I said before, mitzvah has two basic translations. One is commandment, and the other one is a bond. in Hebrew, if you want to talk about a people working together, a crew of people, you call that, they use the same root as the word mitzvah. People join together, people that have one function, they work together in employees of one company, if you will. So the idea of a mitzvah is that it is a bond between us and God, creating a bridge between that which is infinite and that which is finite, which is beyond the realm of possibility, except for the mitzvah. In other words, I think we touched on this last week, but I'm going to go elaborate more on this today. If you want to create a bond between two entities, they have to have something in common. You cannot have a bond between a human being and a rock. They had pet rocks, I know, but that was a little bit of an aberration. You can't have a relationship, a meaningful relationship between a human and an inanimate object because they're worlds apart. There's nothing that could connect them. And yet they have something in common. They're both physical creatures. They're both made up of atoms and subatomic particles, but they're so far apart, there's no way they can have a relationship. Nothing the rock will do will get you to want to marry a rock. I was going to say nothing a plant could do, but now people hug trees, so I don't know if I can say that anymore. And I'm sure there'll be some people who find ways of marrying, rocks and sand and pebbles as well. But we're talking about in the realm of what most normal people think. There are certain things that cannot create bonds with one another. We can hold a rock in our hand, we could grasp it tightly, but there's no relationship. Yet two people who are on two sides of the planet, one is here in Buffalo, the other is in Afghanistan, we could have a very profound relationship with one another, even though we're physically separated, because there's a commonality between two human beings that doesn't exist between a human being and a rock, no matter how close together you are physically. Well, let's take God, who is absolutely infinite, and human beings that are finite beings. I mean, the analogy of a rock to a human being is no analogy. This is truly infinite, truly unbridgeable. There's no way you can have a relationship with something that is beyond being infinite. I mean, infinity is even a limit on it, on God. So how could we have a relationship? The answer is, if it was up to us, if it's up to the rock to do something, to create a relationship, it's impossible. Only God, who is capable of transcending even the limits of infinity and finitude, he could create that bond. If God says, I want you to do this mitzvah, I want you to raise your hand, raising your hand, an insignificant action, becomes the bridge between God and us, because God chose that to be the connecting agent. The analogy is, although all analogies break down after a while because we can never find a good analogy for God and us, but the analogy is of a brilliant scientist who's in his laboratory and his mind is in some, abstract physics, and there's a simple, illiterate janitor who's cleaning up. There's nothing they have in common. There's no way they could communicate. But then the scientist is in the middle of his experiment and he gets thirsty and he can't concentrate, so he says to the janitor, get me a cup of water. Then all of a sudden there's a relationship, because the simple person is now doing something for that sophisticated person. A bond has been created. In a similar fashion, although not identical, God says, I want you to do something for me. God chooses to want us to do things. All of a sudden, a relationship has been created. We bond. We become attached to one another. And that's what a mitzvah is. A mitzvah is the agent that creates a bond between that which is finite and the ultimate infinite creator. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes. Do we have to emulate in that? Okay, that's a very good question. If God did it, there must be a good reason for it. If we would have the same rationalization for it, then we would have to do it. But since we don't have that, and we were told never to do that, we can't. There are things that God does. God performed surgery on Adam and created Eve. You ever see anyone doing that today? You ever see someone taking men and cutting them and taking a rib and trying to create Eve? What? Not yet. We would put them in jail if they would do a thing like that. There are obvious things that we do not emulate God because they are in God's province and they belong to God alone. Creation itself is something that obviously we cannot create something out of nothing. How do we know what to emulate and what not to emulate? That's the real question. And the answer is the Torah itself gives us the guidelines. The Torah doesn't just say emulate God and you break your head to figure out what to emulate and what not to emulate. It gives us the guidelines. Kindness, yes. Cruelty, even in cases where you think it might be justified? No. Unless it's, again, there are times when we do have to fight a war, self-defense, and so on. But as a general rule, we're not supposed to emulate God except those things that the Torah itself tells us to emulate Him. The Torah gives us a list of all the commandments that we have, and none of them are things that we do simply because God does it if it's not something that God wants us to emulate. So that's a very good point. Yes.
Just to answer your question, the generation of Noah was destroyed because of evil. It was immoral. And God didn't like what He had created, so He starts to generate now. Even in the Torah, it says, look, if you don't follow my ways, which is what He wants us to do, these are the things that will happen. But that doesn't mean that God changed His mind or changed. This is what He wanted us to do, and if we don't do it, then He will not allow us to be evil.
Right. There's no question that God gives us the guidelines, but we're just trying to understand the theory behind the things that God tells us to do. That why do we do acts of kindness, besides the fact that it's God's commandment, is because that's our way of emulating God. That becomes a art form in and of itself. Then we go, yes.
There's something about those who are Jewish, this or a number of other religions before these things throughout their lives. And
Right, that has tremendous value. You know, the fact that they're not doing it because God said so diminishes what they're doing. They could have accomplished a lot more, but it doesn't take away from what they're doing. In other words, I would rather be a friend of an atheist who's a nice guy than to have this pious rabbi who likes to hurt people. You know, that's, although I think the pious rabbi has the theory right and the atheist has the theory wrong, I still would prefer someone who I don't have to worry about him stabbing me in the back if I turn around.
God money, in the best sense of that word, without studying the text, without subscribing to a religion, that's, or maybe at best would be a better thing to look at. But they more of those kinds of acts will agree with.
Good for them. That's great. But it's, again, the humanist, the good things that everyone does is never negated because they don't do everything the way it should be. Judaism is not an everything or nothing religion. It values every good act. It would just argue that if your goodness is based simply on rational thought, there's no guarantee that someone else's rational thought might not lead to the opposite conclusion, as we often see, that the same two people come to opposite conclusions as what is good for you and what is bad for you. And having a divine source helps to, number one, guide you what's right and what's wrong, and also gives you the ability to preserve that feeling. And it's also, in the end, it's more rational to believe that there's a God than to believe that everything happens without a God. That's a less rational approach. The divine discipline is another model of a mitzvah. Divine discipline, we all recognize that a human being cannot flourish and perhaps not even survive without some discipline. Without discipline, you have anarchy, and you can't really accomplish anything. You can only destroy without discipline. You can't build without discipline. That's why we go against every human virtue of not enslaving people. We're against slavery, but yet we force children to get an education. That's compulsory education. You would think goes against our abhorrence of slavery or kidnapping. You're forcing the child to be in a certain building. You can't leave that building because we recognize that humanity without discipline, what is education? Education is discipline, is not humanity. Well, in discipline itself, there are different types of disciplines, different levels. And as humans, we need structure. And the ultimate structure obviously comes from the one who created the world and created the idea of structure. So if God says to do a mitzvah, that is the ultimate disciplining force. That's what gives us the ultimate structure. Now, of course, people could self-discipline. They could create systems of their own. But when you have to create your own discipline, it has a built-in weakness. Because whenever you feel you're on a diet, and then you see some good chocolate cake, and you say to yourself, you know what? It won't hurt my diet. I'll start my diet again tomorrow. Oh, you're disciplined. You know exactly what you need and what you don't need. But it's very easy when you know that you're the one who created the discipline. You can create it, and you could cheat and get around it and find ways of rationalizing and not even realizing that you broke down that discipline. A discipline that is mandated from on high, it's not my discipline. It was given to me, and therefore it's a discipline that will have much more effect. It's a balanced discipline because it's another point. There are people who are so disciplined. People in the Eastern cultures are very, very disciplined, and they're so disciplined that they're detached from the physical world to a great extent. They're ascetics. They don't eat. They don't engage in normal. They're celibate. They have tremendous willpower. That's not the way God intended the world to be like. God wanted us to indulge, and He wanted us to have discipline at the same time. So what every mitzvah is, if you really think about the mitzvahs, if you take them in totality, they are there to give us structure to our lives in ways that we are disciplined, but we're not detached from this world. The discipline is one that enriches our lives, doesn't suffocate us. It doesn't make us feel that we're being suffocated by some powerful force that bears down on us. You know, I know for some people, if you tell them they have to keep Shabbos, they feel they're suffocated. They can't do anything. Yeah, it takes some practice. But after a while, they realize that not only is Shabbos not suffocating, it's the most liberating and free expression, that you're free, detached from technology. You just feel you're able to rejuvenate yourself. It becomes a very, very exhilarating thing, but it comes through discipline. So divine discipline is the ultimate discipline, and it's the most balanced form of discipline, and that's what mitzvahs are. Then we go to level number 6, I believe. It's section 7. The introduction was 1. We're up to section number 7, but it's the 6th dimension of a mitzvah. A mitzvah is a form of refinement. Every mitzvah that we do has a different effect on our personality. Certain mitzvahs, it's like exercises. If you go to a trainer, they'll tell you if you do this exercise, it'll work on a certain muscle over here. If you do that exercise, it'll work on a different muscle. And every exercise is intended for every part of your body. That's true physically. It's also true emotionally. There are certain psychological exercises that help you deal with certain psychological issues, emotional issues. And this exercise won't work for another. And then there are spiritual exercises. That's what a mitzvah is. It's a spiritual exercise that helps develop, refine, and hone certain parts of your spiritual and ultimately your emotional and even physical well-being. It says in the Talmud that there are 613 commandments, and the 613 are divided into two parts. There are 248 what you call positive commandments, the ones that you're supposed to do things, and 365 do nots, proscriptive, ones that we're not supposed to do. You're not supposed to murder, you're not supposed to steal. You're supposed to give charity, you're supposed to eat matzah on Passover, you're supposed to love your fellow. These are the do's and there are the don'ts. And the Talmud says that the 248 positive correspond to the 248 bones of the body. Modern medicine claims there are fewer than 248, but the Mishnah actually lists every single bone in the body because at a certain age, I think at 18 years old, it's the point where ligaments have not yet fused together, and they're not ligaments, they're bones, but they haven't fused, so you have exactly 248. But that's not for today to discuss anatomy. What is the meaning of it? That every mitzvah corresponds to 248 parts of the body, and the 365 negative correspond to 365 blood vessels or nerves. It's not clear what they mean by that. But what is the idea of giving you the analogy? But what it's saying is that every mitzvah has a different effect and a different part of your spiritual being, because just like the body has 613 parts, your soul has 613 parts, and every mitzvah touches another part of your soul and refines it and changes your behavior and your character. The word in Hebrew says in the Mishnah that God wanted to give us as much merit as possible. That's why he gave us so many mitzvahs. Now, the Hebrew word for merit is zechut, Sephardic pronunciation. That same word has a root that means refinement. A merit is a refining process. It's not just something that's a means to an end, that you get merit so that while you're judged favorably, it has an immediate effect on refining your character. So that's another aspect of the mitzvah, that it refines people. It makes them, in Yiddish we say, more edel. I've seen people who were not known to be nice people, not known to be refined people, and they started doing mitzvahs, and you could see the change in their personalities. Now, it doesn't work with everyone the same way, because we're not all the same. Some of us are more naturally refined, some of us are more resistant to refinement, some of us do mitzvahs in different ways, and here's where the feeling in the mitzvah has a great effect. The more feeling you have in the mitzvah, not just doing the mitzvah perfunctorily, mechanically, the more you meditate on the mitzvah, the more you reflect on it, the more it will change, and the more refining effects and benefits it will bring. Then we go to number 7. It's a liberating experience. We believe very strongly in the idea of freedom. We are against any form of confinement of an individual. To us, one of the most heinous crimes in society is to abduct someone and keep them prisoner. We call that kidnapping, hostage-taking. It's forbidden, of course, in every civilized society. It's considered to be a heinous crime. But we are guilty of that crime all the time. All of us, to one extent or another. Because we all possess a soul, and the soul is a hostage to our bodies. And that's not our fault. That's the way we were created. God gave us that status. But we have the means to liberate the soul from the body. We can do it. We're given the mechanism to do it. To the extent that I don't want to talk about the negative, let's talk about the positive. To the extent that we do a mitzvah, we are liberating that soul. The soul if it was able to speak to us, it would say, please get me out of here. And that's why people have this sense they want to escape. You find people who want to climb mountains, people who want to run away to the jungles or the deserts, people who want to do things that we call escapism. Why do they want to escape? Because their soul is begging them, please liberate me. And that's why some people even want to die, because their soul is so miserable in this wretched existence that we call life. Even if the person has everything that their hearts desire in terms of material goods, there's no evidence that rich people, successful people, are happier than not rich people. Of course, if someone is miserably poor and starving, that's one thing. But I'm talking about people who have the most basic necessities of life, and that's it. They are usually happier than people who have it all, because the soul is really unhappy. The soul. What motivates people to make money? Let's talk a little bit about that. What motivates people to be very active and productive and enterprising? It's their soul's energy. So the soul's energy wants you to liberate it, so instead you become a CEO. There's nothing wrong with being a CEO. What's wrong is if you think that that's what the soul was looking for, and then you reach the top and you say, you know what, my life is miserable. And that's why we have midlife crisis, and that's why we have all sorts of emotional problems that stem from the fact that the soul feels it's in prison in spite of all of its accomplishments. Do one mitzvah and you liberate the soul from one level of imprisonment. Do another mitzvah, you liberate it from another level of imprisonment. Every mitzvah has the power to allow the soul to express itself. There's a famous parable of the princess and the peasant, where the princess elopes with a gardener, the king's gardener, who was illiterate, and he takes her home, and they're in love for a little while. Then afterwards, she starts thinking about her palace life as opposed to her very low level of material existence that she had now in the peasant's home. And when the peasant sees that she's unhappy, what does he do? He thinks she wants some more vegetables, so he digs up his garden. He brings her turnips and onions and potatoes and carrots, and finally when he's exasperated, he doesn't understand why is she not happy. He's giving her all that he has, and she says, you wouldn't even understand what I'm missing. We're the peasant. The body that we have is the peasant. The soul is the princess. The soul wants to be back in the palace, but the body doesn't understand it, so the body looks for all of the ways of drowning its desires, and it can't feel liberated. And that's why every time we do a mitzvah, we are liberating our soul. Another variation of that theme is the next point, point number 8, and that is, it's the soul's culinary delight. Just like the body has hunger and needs to be nourished and nurtured, the soul also needs to be fed. If the soul is not fed, it gets hungry, hunger pains start to set in, and that develops all sorts of depression and anxiety and all the other conditions that we suffer from as human beings, because the soul is hungry. And when the soul is hungry, what happens when you're hungry and you're starving? You can't think straight. So what happens is people, the more deprived they are of spiritual nourishment, the less they look for the right spiritual nourishment. Because starving people don't know what's good for them because their mind is clouded by the pain, by the hunger, and they can't think straight, so they don't look for the right thing, so they'll eat anything, and it doesn't help them. In fact, it makes them even more ill. So when a person realizes that when you do a mitzvah, you just fed your neshama, you fed your soul, and the soul will cease to have those hunger pains, and when it ceases to have those hunger pains, your mind will be more lucid and more clear, and then you will be able to discover the things that you really need and the things that really make a difference in your life. Number 9, realizing your potential. The world is a stage. The soul is the actor. The soul has an existence before it came into this world. Just like we believe the soul lives on, the soul was always here. Well, where was the soul? The soul was in paradise. What is paradise? Paradise is a spiritual area that doesn't occupy physical space, of course. It's a spiritual state of being. And the soul is an absolute blissful existence. It has a completely spiritual existence that is utterly delightful. And then God thrusts the soul into this physical world. Really doesn't want to be here because it's confining. It has all the pitfalls that, you know, what happens to people with a soul. They can go downhill and turn out to become evil people even. So the soul doesn't want to be here, but it has no choice. There's a reason why the soul is here, and we'll talk about the reason next week. But meanwhile, it's not fair for the soul to have to go down here and to suffer. And the answer is to that, it's not really suffering. On the contrary, when the soul comes into this world, this is the stage where the soul is given the opportunity to express its full potential. You take a child, or an adult for that matter, and you put them in an environment where there are no conflicts, where there are no pitfalls, where there are no obstacles, they will never perform 100%. Their potential will never be realized. You have to have, this is the way God created the world, you have to have obstacles in your path that force you to back up a little and to jump over the obstacle. And you discover that you really have much more energy than you ever imagined that you had. If you wouldn't have the obstacle, if we wouldn't have illness, we wouldn't have all these cures, we wouldn't have all these brilliant medical achievements, scientific achievements. You have to have challenges. That's the way. Did God have to create the world that way? No. But that's fact of life. So when our soul comes into this world, precisely because it is not a conducive world for the spiritual aspirations of the soul is able to express potential that it could never have expressed in paradise. So in that sense, the soul is like an actor on stage. This world is a stage. Everything around us are the props, the costumes, the things through which the soul is able to perform a beautiful, beautiful performance that enables it to realize its full potential. So we go down, but the purpose of going down is to really reach a higher potential than the soul had before it came into this world. What is the mechanism for that? That's what the mitzvah is. The mitzvahs that we do in this world with all of the challenges that we have in order to do the mitzvah is the way the soul performs and expresses its full potential. And that brings it to an even higher level than it was before it descended into this world. And we'll stop it here. We'll try to do 11 next. Yes.
Under off the section 8. Was climbing up.
I think I referred to it briefly. Why do people escape? On climbing a mountain, you're escaping the world that you live in to go to meet this challenge. And if you think, yes, of course, what is the standard answer? Why you climb the mountain? Because it's there. That's not an answer. Because the real reason is your soul wants to climb mountains, spiritual mountains. And you get the sense that you're dissatisfied with where you are and you want to go someplace else and you want to climb. There's a famous dream that many people have, a dream of flying. I think most people have that dream at some point in their lives. And I'm sure Freud has a lot to say about that. But the spiritual reason why we have those dreams is because that's what our soul wants. Our soul wants to fly. That's the aspiration of the soul, and it comes out in various ways. And some people climb mountains, some people meet other challenges that are good. And there's nothing wrong with climbing a mountain. It might be healthy for you, it might be get you away from other things that are troubling. But the real reason is it wants you to grow spiritually. It wants you to climb that spiritual mountain.